Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Community Engagement Manager here at the Haley Public Library. Tonight's reading, A Road Out of Naknek by local author Keith Catalano Wilson, is a journey of contemplative exploration and understanding of oneself through the biological cycles of salmon, long-distance running, and the power of the tide. I always like to feature a book that we have here at the library, and the one that I chose tonight is called Upstream, Searching for Wild Salmon from River to Table by Langdon Cook. It's a new book, and it's been described as an essential look at the intersection of man, food, and nature. And the gentleman who wrote it is a widely recognized writer, as well as has been nominated for a James Beard Cooking Awards. So I thought this was appropriate because of the importance of salmon to Keith's talk, and also that he and his wife have a business that sell salmon locally. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Keith Catalano Wilson. He is an endurance athlete, cross-country coach, teacher, and author from Naknek, Alaska, a place he returns to every summer to harvest salmon as a commercial fisherman. Keith's work has been featured in Mountain Running Magazine, Outdoor Idaho Magazine, Wanderlust Journal, and the Right Launch, and the Young Fisherman's Almanac. You can purchase his book and get it signed this coming Saturday at Haley Coffee Company from 9 to 11. So Keith has a bachelor's and a master's degree in English from Northern Michigan University, and currently he teaches and lives in Haley with his wife Mandy, with whom he sells fish, salmon, via their business, Wilson's Wild Salmon. So without further ado, I would like to give a warm virtual welcome to you, Keith, and you will need to unmute yourself. And I am also going to spotlight you, so the rest of us will disappear and you will be spotlighted. Are you able to bring that up okay? Maybe yeah. I'll just wait just a sec until you. Great. Okay, so I'm going to spotlight you. There we go. And for some reason, there we go. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight. This just sounds like a wonderful book and a wonderful topic. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Yeah, of course. So my book is called A Road Out of Naknek. Oops. And there's a reason I decided to title that. And there's symbolic reasons for that, some metaphorical reasons for that, but it's quite literally named after the one stretch of road, the one stretch of pavement that's 16 miles long from the Fisherman's Bar in Naknek to the King Salmon Airport in King Salmon. And anything beyond that is tundra and water. And when I was a teenager, I started running along that road. And one day I went far enough to reach the end of the road. And that's where the title comes from. And I take that in some different directions. Now, the subtitle is Alaskan Salmon Fishing, Long Distance Running, and Life According to the Tide. The motif of the chapter I'll be reading today is mostly that life according to the tide, but I think that all of it has to do with life according to the tide. And the thing about the tide I want to recognize before I start reading is that a long time ago, when we spoke Middle English rather than modern English, what we speak today, the word tide, which is very closely related to the word time, was just a measurement of any period of time, which could be a year, an epoch, an age, or an hour, or a season, or a day, such as the Yuletide, which is, of course, the shortest day of the year as far as daylight goes. So I started thinking about this. And by the way, running and fishing, you have so much time to think, and that's where a lot of these thoughts come from. So I started thinking about, well, a tide really could be, it could be the time between footsteps. It could be the time between heartbeats. It could be the time it takes for me to breathe in and out. I breathe in, that's the flood. I breathe out, that's the ebb. But with every tide, between every ebb and flood comes a slack tide where there's stillness. And that's the kind of stillness that I like to feel when I run. It's almost as if between those foot strikes, I'm defying gravity, and those slack tides, if you will, kind of become one. And the same kind of thing happens when you get into that flow state, as we call it. Even fishing, pulling the nets, and just kind of being in your thoughts. And you start at one end of the net, and before you realize it, you're already at the end, because you've found that stillness within movement. And that's kind of what I want to get across about the tide. That's the secret of the tide that I want to share today before I start reading. So we have some people who are familiar with Alaska geography and some people who are not, but this is the state of Alaska, and Naknek is here with this red pin. Bristol Bay is this corner of the Bering Sea, which goes all the way out here to Russia. People have probably heard maybe of Fairbanks, Anchorage, Juneau is over here. Nome, known for the gold rush, possibly Barrow, which is known as being the northernmost city in the United States, or actually North America, I think. But if we zoom in, once again, we have the red dot right where Naknek is. This is the cover art of my book. This is an illustration that I hand drew. And then a friend of mine was kind enough to colorize it and stylize it and really make a beautiful cover design. But out here, so this is again, this is the Nagyak Bay. It goes up into the Nagyak River. This is the Naknek River. This is Naknek. The literal road out of Naknek comes along here to King Salmon. But then, of course, we go beyond that in reality and in the symbols and metaphors that I include in the storyline. And one thing, again, that I just want people to keep in mind, that there's an ebb and flood to everything. For me, a lot of that is with fishing, with running, and with my return to Naknek and my life outside of that world for the rest of the year. Because I go back every summer, and I've been fishing since I was 11 years old, but I was born and raised in Alaska. I grew up in Naknek from the time I was an infant to the time I was 18. And that's also another ebb and flood to my own story, but I think that everybody has an ebb and flood, which is why I really like to get this message across. I have some pictures here of fishing and running. I think the running pictures are pretty self-explanatory. You go up a hill, you go in front of Baldy, if you recognize Bald Mountain back there a little bit. These are the Salt Flats in Utah. That's the Salt Flats 50 miler, which I was lucky enough to win that race a few years ago. I went back to it last year. It didn't go so well, but that's another story. I don't want to get into too many details without getting into what I'm going to read today. But this is screwing in an auger anchor. This is what our net is attached to on shore at low tide. The tide comes all the way up to where you can see this grass, and then it comes out to where you can see this entire tidal flat. Here's me picking a fish. Here's me throwing an anchor to set the net. That would be the outside of what you see here. And this is the middle of that process where the net's actually coming out of the skiff into the water. And then there's some more fishing pictures. And if you can see the screen, I know there's a little bit of a delay, but if you can see what I'm looking at here, this is what I see most of the summer. This is more of what I see most of the summer. This is what my beautiful wife who fishes with me now sees when I'm out in the water, when it starts getting shallow and I have to wade to get another fish. And then this bottom right corner is me in my first year fishing in the yellow rain jacket. I'm 11 years old, and that was at the time one of our biggest days that we've ever had. We've since had bigger days. So with that, I'm going to take the liberty of reading from my book, the first chapter, Road Out of Naknek, Alaskan Salmon Fishing, Long Distance Running, and Life According to the Tide. My chapters don't have titles. What I have are pictures of fish, and there's always a fish going forward, representing being back there fishing. And there's always in the next chapter, a fish going forward because I'm moving on with life, whether I'm going through high school, going to college, buying a first house, traveling somewhere, etc. Have a little water here. Fresh water, not the salt water that the salmon live in for most of their life before they return to spawn. The tide waits for no one. I don't know how many times I've heard Dad say it, but he's right. It's both time and tide, as the adage goes, that stayeth for no man. But I've learned that time and tide are synonymous, and they wait for no woman, child, flower, fur bearer, or fish either. I was never a stellar student, but I paid attention to the interesting parts. And as I understand it, gravity between the sun, our planet, and the moon pulls the ocean in a rhythm as reliable as night and day, summer and winter, or spring and fall. It creates ebbs and floods in a pattern that the rotation of a clock, the breath in a pair of lungs, or the beating of a heart could never match. The tide was turning long before life existed, and it will keep turning long after we're gone. I've also learned that life on our planet began in the ocean, but I think it was the tide that brought it ashore. Then wind pushed microbes and flora above the shoreline, seeds spread and bacteria colonized. Amphibians started crawling and turned into reptiles. Some reptiles became birds, others became mammals. Now snakes slither after frogs, frogs feed on flies, and seagulls scavenge for scraps. Great apes pick fruit dangling from trees. Species feed on one another, existing in one complex food web. Not entirely separate, life in the ocean has developed its own similar system. On the surface, fish leap and splash, whales spew geysers, and birds swoop to scoop plankton and minnows. But although the ocean is not entirely separate from land, beneath the surface is unfathomable and alien to us. It teems with great white black-eyed monsters, mammalian torpedoes speaking in sonar, water-breathing exoskeleton spiders, and eight-legged monsters with the ability to change color and texture. In the darkest depths and deepest canyons, anglerfish navigate with flashlights protruding from their foreheads. There are cat sharks, seahorses, and lizardfish with luminous skin. Mountains range between poles, and life thrives at every level from floor to surface. If there is any separation between land and the ocean, it's the shoreline, but it's indistinct and formless. The border between ripples and solid ground is ever moving, ever changing. It was only a matter of time before one of the land animals decided to push the boundaries. First, Some of the apes stood upright and walked on 2 feet and became people. We could walk and we can run farther than any other bipedal species. And we used the ability to exhaust our prey, club them to death, and have abundant sources of meat, allowing our brains to develop. With this development, we gained a sense of ownership of land, trees, other animals, and even each other. With the new fascination with borders and lines, pushing beyond the shoreline was inevitable. At first, we waited, careful not to be caught in a current or eaten by a leviathan. Then we built rafts, kayaks, and canoes. We built bidarkas, boats, ships, and submarines. Vessels navigated between continents, and people conquered and eradicated each other using waterways as transport. We scoured the ocean, harvesting shrimp, shellfish, sharks, and sardines, decimating populations. To people, the ocean was an endless void. Even now, after having left more footprints on our planet than any other species, we've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. The tide, however, washes away all footprints. It washes away a skeleton just as it does a tree branch. It washes away a village or a city the same as it does a sandcastle. The Atlantic, Arctic, Indian, Southern, Pacific, and all smaller seas are one mass of water, ebbing and flooding into each other. The Pacific is the largest portion of it, covering more of our planet's surface than all the continents combined. It was this way during the time of the land we now call Beringia, a conglomerate of what is now Russia, Alaska, and land between them. It was a barrier between the Pacific and the Arctic. But as the water level climbed, it receded to an isthmus we now call the Bering Land Bridge. Before seafaring, people hiked the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to the Norton Sound, following mammoths, musk oxen, and antelope. Then the water level got too high, and the tide was never again low enough to forge from one side to the other. The Bering Land Bridge narrowed until the Pacific met the Arctic, and the Bering Sea drowned it. Now, as the tide ebbs and floods against the shores of Russia and Alaska, Beringia is but another part of the ocean floor where there have been no footsteps in thousands of years. Some people migrated north and gave themselves names like Inupiat, Sugpiaq, and Inuit. Others migrated east as Athabascans and southeast as Tlingit, Tsimshian, and Haida. Farther south, people became Cherokee, Anishinaabe, Shawnee, Shoshone, and Sioux. Even farther south were Apache, Anasazi, and Aztecs. The Maya, Inca, and Aymara went almost as far south as they could get. Their ancestral land is estranged as the deepest parts of the ocean. Some people, however, stayed pressed against the Bering Sea. They were the Yupik, the Unangan, and some of the Athabascan people. The Unangan settled across the Aleutian chain, a string of tiny islands that were once Beringia's tallest mountaintops. Maybe these Bering Sea people were left behind when others migrated south, but I think they stayed on purpose. They learned the power of the tide. They learned to harvest their sustenance from the Bering Sea with driftwood bidarkas, harpoons, hooks, and grass ropes. They hunted whales, clubbed seals, and caught trout, smelt, herring, and salmon. They had no system of numbers, no units of measurement, and they never had to worry about catching too many fish. The Bering Sea narrows into Bristol Bay, north of the Alaska Peninsula and south of the Kuskokwim Mountains. It is a body of water where the difference between the ebb and flood changes the shoreline more drastically than sunrise, sunset, or the changing seasons change the amount of warmth and light. Starting in the late spring, millions of salmon gather to Bristol Bay from the Pacific to fulfill their final purpose. First, they mill and swirl in the salt water like the tick around the face of a clock, each one waiting for the right wind, the right temperature, the right moment in the tide. Then they disperse into freshwater rivers, forging toward the headwaters. In schools and surges, they make their run toward their natal lakes and streams. They forge against the current, moving straight ahead to spawn, die, and continue a pattern that was in existence before the first twine was woven, before the first bidarka was built, and before the first human hand ever touched the water. Yupik people established the village of Nagyak at the mouth of one of these rivers flowing into Bristol Bay. They named the village after their word for a muddy place, where the tide climbs to cut banks on either side, distilling the sand into swirls and flows of thick brown ebbs and floods. The Yupik were the first people to catch the salmon there. They filleted and cooked them, or they cut them into strips to dry over a rack in the open air. They saturated these strips in the smoke of slow-burning birch and alder, beads of oil dripping from deep red meat with a strip of skin with its golden luster shining in the near midnight sun. However, it wasn't too long before Russians invaded Southwest Alaska. Yupik were overtaken, Unangan were called Aleut, mistaking the word for island as the name for people. Athabascans migrated away. Russians mispronounced Nagyak, and it was put on the map as Naknek. Soon enough, Russians claimed all of Alaska as their property and later exchanged it with other invaders who had claimed another massive land far to the south. They traded it for bits of paper and metal called currency and invented ebb and flood of numbers. Some of that metal had brought people rushing to other parts of Alaska like Nome in the Yukon, villages turning into towns of roughneck saloons and bearded sourdoughs. In Bristol Bay, the promise of currency was in exchange for salmon. People from all over our planet arrived in places like Naknek, Igigik, Togiak, Dillingham. Like the Yupik, Unangan, and Athabascan before them, they learned to work with the ebb and flood. They depended on the tide to launch sailboats, release nets, and catch millions upon millions of salmon. Canneries were erected, ports were constructed, and villages sprouted into towns where salmon were caught, gutted, shoved into cans, and shipped on barges along the coast and across the ocean. The village of Pavik on the north side of the Naknek River was soon connected by a dirt path to King Salmon, the site of an Air Force base put in place during World War II. During the Cold War, it was ready and able to defend against any sudden attack from the Soviets. With the advent of air travel and the King Salmon Airport, more newcomers flocked to Pavik than to Naknek, and Pavik was deemed the new Naknek. The old Naknek, once Nagyak, became South Naknek. The three towns together became the Bristol Bay Borough. The dirt path between Naknek and King Salmon was named the Alaska Peninsula Highway and paved. Meanwhile, down the continent, across the Pacific, and across the Atlantic, salmon populations were disappearing. Most people didn't know or care, but some people wanted to prevent it from happening in Bristol Bay. Some of these people organized and called themselves the Alaska Territorial Fishery Service. Like invading Russians, they were self-proclaimed. Unlike invading Russians, few people believed in their claim. First, Alaska had to be called a state. Then the Alaska Territorial Fishery Service could become the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Only then could their rules be established and their suggestions could be put into practice. Now, based on a statement, nets are allowed in the water during designated times coinciding with the tide. It's not perfect, but it's an instance where people have learned to not only accept the ancient pattern of the tide and the annual influx of salmon, but to work with it and to limit the harvest and enable the salmon's return again and again. Bristol Bay holds the last most sustainable fisheries on our planet. In Naknek, we can witness the power of the tide with the naked eye. At the ebb on the Naknek River, the water is not much more than a trickle through ever-shifting mudflats. Skiffs and subsistence nets slope downward with the beach. Canneries reach out onto docks on top of crooked, splintering pilings. Drift boats tie together in a line of vessels stretching into the channel. Flocks of seagulls gather, flapping and squawking, pecking at guts and grime from processors. Skiffs lay in the mud with their anchors stabbed into the beach. As the water flows out into the ocean, pilings are like trunks of trees rising. Tributaries as thin as bones of fingers trickle down into the mud, into what's left of the channel. After the water has disappeared into the forever of the ocean, movement ceases. Twigs, leaves, clumps of grass, and bubbles aren't drifting along the surface, but they remain in the stillness of slack tide. Then, as though a table were tilted, the tide begins to shift direction. It moves faster and faster, and white water gushes over the mudflats as boats rock and thrash as the waves chop like madmen with axes. Pilings sink into the water. Outside the mouth of the Naknek River is the Naknek-Kwijak district of the fishery, where commercial fishermen use gill nets. Salmon swim into these nets anchored between buoys placed there by set netters like Dad and me. In the deeper water, they collide into nets floating behind drift boats with spacious decks and cockpits and onboard sleeping quarters. Aluminum and fiberglass hulls smash each other in the battle for the optimal spot at the border where fish swim thickest. Cork lines splash with heads and tails on the surface. Corks bob from hits below it. Salmon are caught, delivered, processed, and dispersed to small family operations, Pike Place Market in Seattle, restaurants in Tokyo, street vendors in London, and all quarters of the continents, in places where salmon used to return and places where they've never swum. Above the water, above the cut bank, most traffic downtown is the cannery workers on foot. Between meals at Peter Pan, Red Salmon, Silver Bay, or whatever cannery employs and houses them, they linger along the paved shoulder of the Alaska Peninsula Highway, traveling in tribes. There are Japanese workers with knee-high gray rubber boots, Ukrainian teenagers with dreadlocks and bandanas, white trash with neck tattoos and face piercings, mustached Mexicans blaring music from smartphones, and lanky West Africans appearing as tall as phone poles. These living, breathing stereotypes are the perfect demonstration of the diversity of who gathers to Bristol Bay. Fishermen linger out of Naknek trading with plastic bags of Kraft macaroni, cans of Bush's baked beans, and bananas as brown as the beach. They head back to their boats, back to their camps, back to their bunks at the cannery before they can fish again. People stumble off the steps of Fisherman's Bar, Hadfield's, and the Red Dog, hoping the money they've made this season hasn't disappeared into the Bermuda Triangle. Boxes of leftover pizza leave D&D restaurant and cars and onto backs of four-wheelers, held down by bungee cords. The aroma of grease and scraps attract tagless dogs that wander town like the silent homeless population they are. By the end of July, salmon numbers taper and fade to the occasional splash or bob of a cork. Fishermen and cannery workers load planes taking off from king salmon. Then there are none. Boats fill the boatyards and canneries board their windows. Seldom is a car on the road, and foot traffic is no longer people, but the occasional dog or brown bear searching for scraps. Off in the distance, a sudden shout or a gunshot might echo across town without question. The gate in front of every cannery closes, and Naknek is still, like the Naknek River in the moments of slack tide. 500 or so people stay in Naknek, picking berries, hunting moose and caribou, chopping firewood, and winterizing pipes. Many of these people are direct descendants of people who walked the Bering Land Bridge. Many of them are not. No matter their ancestry, people who stay in Naknek see yellow leaves fall from birch and alders as cold air creeps its way across the tundra like a ghost, leaving it brown and dead in its wake. The days get shorter, the nights get darker. It will be months before the salmon return again. It will be months before the masses again arrive at King Salmon Airport. Meanwhile, out in Bristol Bay, the Bering Sea, and the depth and expanse of the ocean, the tide ebbs and floods as our planet and its moon orbit around the sun. That's chapter 1, folks. And again, I will be at Haley Coffee Company from 9 to 11 this Saturday. And I will open up for questions. Comments are also welcome. And questions can be really anything. Questions could be about the tide, the fishing. It could be about running. It could be about the writing process or what have you.
So Keith, I'm going to remove the spotlight on you,
All
and
right.
that will allow, I think, other people to pop up.
Okay.
And I know just from our earlier conversations that Sarah and John are familiar with, am I saying it right? Naknek?
Naknek, yeah.
Naknek. And a friend of mine, Sarah, a different Sarah, her husband spent some time in Naknek recently.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so, but before we go into questions, I would just like to thank you for a wonderful reading. Your writing style is incredibly descriptive in what to me is the most wonderful way. I felt like I could, hear the splash of the waves. I could smell the aroma. I could see what you were describing. I really enjoyed that very much.
Thank you.
Whoops. Take the video, the stop video thing off. So anyway, I have a question just to get started, I guess. You use the term ebb and flood. Mm-hmm. That is not a term I've ever heard. I've heard ebb and flow. And I just wondered if that's if that's something from that Alaskan culture, or if maybe growing up in Idaho like I did, I wasn't familiar, with other ways of using that term. I just wonder if you have any insights on that.
For the most part, I could blame colloquialism, but I also, because I've been asked this question before, and I think of it like it's always, other than slack tide, it's always flowing. The ebb is a flow. The flood is also a flow. So the flow is going one direction or another, and that's the way I've always looked at it. But I was definitely introduced to ebb and flood before I ever heard ebb and flow. And so I was pretty young when I thought, well, wait a minute, isn't it always flooding? So,
yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
yeah.
So Sarah and John, do you have any questions or reminiscences from your time in Naknek? Oh, you'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
How's that?
It's good. Yeah.
I hear you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of reminiscences, but I'd like to know, Keith, have you ever wanted to go back and spend the winter, like go be the high school English teacher, raise your family there? Have you ever thought about that?
Let's see. The last time I was in Naknek in the winter, I was 19 years old during my freshman year of college. But my parents moved. They stopped spending all year there after my freshman year of college, and I never really had a reason to go back in the winter. But there was one year, I don't even remember where I was in life or where I was living, but I remember my English teacher, Mr. Townsend, as you remember, he resigned and left, and I had a friend of mine call me and say, hey, this is open. And I was at a point in my life, I was just absolutely not ready to go back there and live, because I wanted to experience the world on the road system, which, I've always appreciated living in the lower 48 and being able to go virtually anywhere, which is something I didn't have in Naknek. And that was part of the feeling of isolation that I had there. But I say that and I keep going back every summer. And, fishing can be a really miserable experience a lot of the time. And that's the irony of everything, is as I keep going back, and I think it goes beyond money. I think it goes beyond, it goes beyond money. Like there's something else, like a voice calling me back there, the same thing that's calling the fish back there, the way that they can figure out that that's where they need to be when the time comes. So there's your very vague answer that doesn't quite answer the question, but maybe it's a possibility. Let's just say that.
No, I get it. Wow. Just the fact that you would say it's a possibility is amazing. They say, fishing, it gets in your blood, and then you miss it when you're not there. And you've done it for so long that, yeah, right. It's got to be there.
When COVID was threatening, like maybe we're not even going to have a season this year. I started fishing when I was 11 years old. So my last real 4th of July, and my mom took me to California and I saw fireworks, and I was 10 years old, like the last time I really experienced summer as the way people think of summer. And it's like, so much of me always thinks like, oh, someday, but like when it came time when, oh, I might not be fishing this year, like that was hard. But then we fished as normal and everything, a few changes, but still continued the process of the return, the ebb and flood.
So our oldest son, Luke, fished with Keith, and I think that was his first fishing job was with your dad. And I know he had a lot of respect for your dad. And I don't know if you ever read the story that he wrote for the Anchorage Daily News writing contest.
Yes, my dad's name was Gary in the story. Yes, I remember that. It's not his real name, by the way. It does start with a G.
Yeah, but that was a really good experience for him. And I remember him coming home I think they hit $1,000 day, and that was big and really something.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a lot of respect for your family.
And Luke, by the way, also, Sarah and John are being humble, but Luke wrote the foreword to my book, which I really appreciated. That was very meaningful to me that he did that.
I think Luke was honored with that request. Luke's younger sister, Rachel, who's our oldest daughter, I don't know if you're aware that for her master's thesis, she went back and studied like 10 years worth of graduates out of Naknek High School. And that was her master's thesis, was where have these kids gone? The success, 10 years worth of high school graduates. And she was able to, I think, find pretty much all of them and see, did they go back? Did they end up back in Naknek? Were they like what society would term successful? So that was pretty interesting, because it seems, the school is so much smaller now than it was when you were there. Like, I think there's a lot of empty classrooms. In my last few years at this school, I ended up down in the high school wing teaching high school classes. And once in a while, I would run into a former student that had come back and had come to the school to say hi, and they were looking for their old teachers, and very few of them were there. I think they retired and moved on. Yeah, which was kind of sad for them.
When I was a kid, there was, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, please. I'll ask my question in a second.
When I was a kid, we had a PE teacher, we had a science teacher, we had an English teacher, and so on. And now, because I have friends that work in the school system there, I see like they're doing what a lot of small schools are doing all over, and like you have one person doing 3 or 4 things. But I'm also happy to see that, or at least happy to hear that those names that I'm familiar with, they come across them in boxes, like old boxes that things are in, say Mr. Bakun, the legendary PE teacher, Mr. Kruppel, legendary science teacher, and so on.
Yeah, my question was, I didn't really get a sense of how big Naknek was. What's the well, you said it shrank down to 500 people over the winter. How big does it swell in the summer?
So, I mean, the population ranges from about 500 to 600 year round, but in the summertime, we're looking at about 6,000 people. And that's fishermen, that's cannery workers. I mean, a lot of fishermen and cannery workers, but there's, extra police force, things like that. Everything is expanded, and you notice it. When you're there after the fishing season, you notice it. You notice the silence and the stillness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that paints a strong picture in terms of the ebb and flood that you were mentioning, a flood of people coming in.
Right.
Yeah. One thing that you said, several things that were really interesting. Your description of the word tide and the early English word that it derived from was fascinating. And how tide really was a different way of saying time. And it could be a very short measurement, like a heartbeat, or a very long measurement. Was that true in Old English too, that the meaning was so fluid like that?
Yeah, the word tide was used as a measurement of time, which is, like I said, there was the noontide, the eventide. They didn't say noon and evening. They actually said those words. And it was a measurement of time. Now, saying that it's a heartbeat or this time between footsteps, that's kind of my own idea, and putting that, taking that concept of a measurement of time and taking the liberty of thinking of it that way. But it wasn't until Bede, the author Bede of Middle English, who he wrote on the reckoning of time, and that was the first time ever that the tide was specific to the ebb and flood of the ocean. And then from then on, it just caught, and that's how we started using that word.
Could you talk a little bit too about that road, that 16-mile road? So was that the beginning of the road and the end of the road was 16 miles later? So I know a lot of times in coastal Alaska, there aren't roads really that go back inland, that they're really tied in with coastal communities, and then the economics that of going along the coast. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So most of Alaska is villages and towns that are away from a road system. You get into the southeast, you get into central Alaska, you could drive. The epitaph in the beginning of my book is the road must eventually lead to the whole world, which is from Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And in that passage of that book, they talk about we could go to the tip of South America if we wanted. You could do that from Anchorage. You could do that from Wasilla or Fairbanks. You could do that from any of those places. But most of Alaska is villages and towns that are isolated from any kind of road system. But the thing about Naknek is it's one stretch of 16-mile pavement that goes literally from Fisherman's Bar in Naknek to the King Salmon Airport. Now, there's some gravel roads, like we have a beach access road, we have Ralph's Road. There are a couple of gravel roads, but as far as a paved highway goes, that's what we have. Does that answer your question about that?
It does. It does. And it helps me to understand the sense of isolation. And I lived on an island once, and I'm from Idaho. And I felt that living on an island was very uncomfortable because I was used to wide open spaces and being able to, just kind of walk limitlessly. Right. And so anyway, I was thinking about that when I was thinking about your life as a young man there, and that impulse to take the road out from Naknek.
And during the COVID times, when we were concerned about, what if flights stop going in? What if flights stop going out? And it actually came to my attention for the first time. And at this point, I'd finished writing the book, but it came to my attention that you can take your boat, you could go up the Nagyak River onto Lake Iliamna, the largest lake in Alaska. And on the other side of Lake Iliamna, there's a family that has a truck and a trailer that will take you to the ocean side. And then you can take your boat and you can get onto the road system. And
wow.
And that is like I wish I had known about that, or that had come to my attention when I was writing the book. But there is a literal road out of Naknek, which is a waterway. And that's actually what I was going to mention, is that also the road, the Alaska Peninsula Highway, runs parallel, not perfectly parallel, but to the river. A river has curves and swirls, and a road is man-made, so it can be more straight. There's a couple of curves on that road, but just don't roll your car. You'll be.
So what led you out of Naknek?
What led me out? I was 18 and I was going to college, and I get into this in the book, and this is actually where I start in my second chapter. Is I majored in not living in Naknek. I didn't have a career path. I didn't have any idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be somewhere else, and college just seemed like the conventional path to do that. And I don't want to say too much about my lack of direction in life that goes from there, because that's what the narrative is about. But there's always the one consistency of returning to Naknek every summer.
Just like the salmon.
It was not hard to motivate our 4 kids to go on to college because the alternative was to spend the winter in Naknek. And once you go to high school, it's like, you work at the grocery store. It's cold. There's, as far as dating for a young man. Keith, you know Bucko Anguson. That,
Oh, yeah.
His quote was like, "Yeah, a pretty girl behind every tree," or he had a nephew move out, a teenager, and the kid had said, "There's not very many cute girls," and Bucko told him, "Oh, wait 2 weeks, they'll all be cute." But
well, there wasn't very many trees either.
yeah, that's why it was a joke. Yeah. But yeah, spending the winter, because we still own our house there. And we left 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And none of our kids really want to, live there year round, but they don't want us to sell the house either. So that's kind of funny how that works out.
Well, if we don't have any other questions from folks, Sarah and John, was there anything else you wanted to add about your life in Naknek or in knowing Keith or his family?
I remember Keith running up and down the Naknek Highway all the time. And we always used to go to George and Kitty's house. That's Keith's mom and dad. Not always, but we'd go to parties there, dinners, and sit and talk. And that was always nice. That's how we socialized. And I was going to ask Keith if he ever sees Luke, because he's up there now.
I do.
You see him when you're putting your boats in at the dock?
I do. I see him at the dock. We give a little fist bump.
So Keith, did you ever, that's not the safest highway to run up and down. Like Jenny Whitten was riding a pedal bike down that road and got hit in the head with the side mirror of a truck going by. Did you have any close calls, or did you always run facing traffic so you don't get hit in the back? Like 2 pedestrians just got killed, a couple weeks ago out there, run over late at night, probably dark, nobody sees them, maybe they're on the road.
Yeah, there was a person who was killed in a hit and run this summer. It was late at night. So, honestly, that is a concern, but at the same time, so is running into a bear, running into a drunken somebody who's coming from the Red Dog and wants your wallet, and that's happened to people before. I tend to think about those things more often, and I have encountered bears while I'm running on that road, and it's I can run here and be attacked by a mountain lion, and there's always a risk. There's a risk in everything. There's a risk in fishing. There's a risk in being a teacher. There's a risk in life. And I follow the rules of the road, and I run on the correct side of the highway, and I do what I can, but there's no perfect answer to that.
So Keith, we're really proud of what you've done, and glad that you could do this. It would have been great if it could have been live. They get really good crowds at the Haley Library and Ketchum Library. We've gone up there a number of times when they have writers do readings. So, but hey, that's COVID, right?
Right.
We are looking forward to the time when we can do these things in person, believe me, very much so. But I did want to just conclude with a note from one of our attendees. She says, thanks, Kristen and Keith. Her husband, Bill, listened in, and just a few weeks ago, he was traveling that road between the town and the airport. He was providing backup for the power plant engineer who was out fishing.
I always think there's something special about this community. I've run into so many people who they go up there, they've worked on a tender, they've worked on a boat, they've done something up there. I've run into people that were stationed at the Air Force Base when it was still active. It's closed now. And I've run into these people really my entire adult life as I've lived outside of Naknek, but this community especially, there's just seems to be this high concentration. And I think that's kind of why I feel like I belong here. And maybe it's because the salmon once returned here in as abundant numbers as they returned there now.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that unexplainable voice.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for a really wonderful reading, and Sarah and John and Mandy and Sarah and the folks who will be watching this video when it's posted up on our website. We sure do appreciate your sharing this story of a road out of Naknek. Sorry, I stumble on that. So
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Yeah.
good. Excuse me. Go ahead.
I was just saying this is great. We're proud of you, Keith.
Thank you.
Mm. All right. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
All right.
Mm.